check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The Carbon Containment Lab is relatively new, but already has a stellar reputation for finding innovative solutions that focus on projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Why has the Carbon Containment Lab chosen to focus on refrigerants?
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me as part of this really great panel. We are, as we mentioned when you introduced our organisation, we've been thinking a lot about different climate solutions, how to advance them. We kind of bring this perspective coming from an investment lens, as well as scientific, sort of more research lens to different climate problems. And we try to do that with a real spirit of entrepreneurship, so we look for things that can be done pretty rapidly and quickly. So actually the story started for us on refrigerants with one of our student interns, who was a Yale student, had read many years before when he was in high school, the Project Drawdown reports, who they recognised refrigerants as being one of the top ways to actually reduce emissions. He got inspired as a high school student, then as a Yale student, of actually looking for refrigerants, inventorying what's happened. He did a big project on campus where, long story short, he found that we were really underreporting our emissions from refrigerants by almost 100%. And there was just like a lot that wasn't being properly inventoried or actually accounted for. And so he later joined our lab. This is Tilden Chow. And my executive director, Dean Takahashi, and I, the dean in particular, is wonderful at spotting talent of some of these younger students and people really excited about finding, climate solutions now and different opportunities. So following Tilden's lead, we started getting interested in this area, and a few of the different things that we've looked at are sort of bringing some of the perspective I brought of like procurement and how to work with large purchasing agencies. So we see that as really interesting. And I'd love to talk more about what the opportunities there are, as well as, how we're going to finance any of this. So we've been looking at carbon markets as one of many mechanisms, and not in all countries, but in some countries that can help. And then policy. So there's a lot of laws, there's a lot of international action on this issue as well. And what we've been trying to do is position lifecycle refrigerant management and sort of broadly like technological changes to large systems as a potential climate activity through the Montreal Protocol community, as well as through the climate negotiations that are happening. So there is a lot of international interest in this area, and what we've found is there's some really amazing work that's already been done, and many of the people who've been involved in that are actually in the room, so periodically I might be pointing at different people to lend their views here. So, we try to look for sort of niches of where we can add value and contribute to this issue, but fundamentally we see refrigerants as really undervalued as a climate solution. We think that it's sort of hiding in plain sight, that it's very feasible. It's not like a major technological leaps that need to happen, unlike some of the CCS or carbon removal areas and other areas we're looking into. It's more of a problem of incentive and motivation and accounting and purchasing. So this seems doable to us. This seems like not just by us, but by society. We can make a massive difference really soon, and we need to do this and do it, address this issue really quickly. So that's our bit of our interest in the area, and it's very much sort of an evolving and collaborative effort with a lot of other groups as well.
If we were to rate the global warming potential of refrigerants, using a 20-year half-life instead of the typical 100-year half-life, how would that change our assessment of mitigating refrigerant emissions?
Well, so over 100 years, many refrigerants, these are short-lived climate pollutants, so they're up in the atmosphere for a shorter period of time. They're very, very potent, and then, they dissipate. So if you spread that out over 100 years, which is typical, it lowers the total global warming potential numbers. So if you do it over 20 years, you basically, even higher global warming potential. potential over that shorter period of time. So basically what that does, if you take a 20-year time period, these become even more valuable to mitigate sooner. And that's not just true for refrigerants, but also other short-lived climate pollutants like methane, black carbon, nitrous oxide, and so on. So, basically we think this is really undervalued by carbon markets, by people working in climate solutions, and some of the fundamental metrics need to be rethought a little bit here. And I think there's like the Global Heat Reduction Initiative is just launched as a new carbon registry, who's also thinking along these lines. Others are as well. So yeah, that's the basics of it.
Anybody else?
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay, perfect. And I think to your point, when we look at climate technologies globally, right, across all these different sectors that we need to address, you look at like steel and cement decarbonization, where there really aren't clear pathways yet of how we do that. It becomes even more important that we achieve all the emissions that we can today, right now. Refrigerants is one of those in that category of things that we can do something about right now, because it has a high global warming potential in a shorter time frame. Like those emission reductions matter a lot in the short term and can buy us more time for those longer term projects that we still don't have clear pathways on.
Anastasia, one of the lab's first areas of focus was lifecycle refrigerant management. Why is lifecycle refrigerant management so important?
Okay, so lifecycle refrigerant management is just a concept whereby you're looking at the existing refrigerants that are already in, all sorts of equipment, in the cars, in the buildings, and so on. How can we actually manage them to not leak and to be properly disposed of at end of life? And then obviously at the long term you want to start to use lower global warming potential gases and or just new alternative cooling technologies. But really for the bank, which is the large bank and ever growing of emissions that are, refrigerants that are already out there, many of them today are in fact leaking. And then with this very high potency, and then at end of life of that equipment, they're quite commonly not properly disposed of or destroyed. And so they just emitted then too. So there's a lot of maintenance stuff that can be done, leak detection things that can be done, all sorts of just taking care to actually reclaim, like take the gases out and recover them, either recycle them, clean them up and use them again, or properly destroy them. So there's a lot of activities under this broad umbrella of lifecycle refrigerant management that are very sort of doable. That's why we find them very interesting. It's not necessarily like a technological challenge, more of an incentive one.
Are we going to be good at this? What are the main challenges to advancing lifecycle refrigerant management in the U.S.? And I'll put that to the whole panel.
Hi, Rebecca Saad-Sitting, representing the Department of Energy. What I've found is that being a grad student, testing refrigerants and stuff, I was preparing for the EPA 608 exam, if you're aware of that. So it said that the penalty for leaking like a pound of high GWP refrigerant, if you don't have that certification, is like $50,000 US. So the reason that I was doing that certification was that so I would be certified. So in my head I was like, so if I leak that refrigerant, if I have that certification, nobody can impose that penalty on me. So
Thanks for being honest.
So I do feel that recently EPA did announce something that it's a rule that would basically help to reclaim and reuse refrigerants. So we are taking a step in the right direction, but I feel it's definitely been on the slower side. There is a high, like in Europe, I've seen that some new HVAC products are actually being sold with reclaimed refrigerant. It is a myth that reclaimed / recycled refrigerant doesn't give you the performance a brand new virgin refrigerant would give you, but that is a myth, and I'm glad we are taking steps in that direction, but we're a bit late.
I just add, so I'm Thatcher from the Clean Fight. We, in our programs, work with a lot of building owner operators. We have a program we'll talk about in a bit, working with owner operators of tall buildings. We also have a program right now with sort of grocers and other retailers in food. And I would say across all of them, now we work with folks who opt in to work with us, right? And they know we're about decarb, so you have to keep that in mind. But across all of them, there's a recognition that refrigerant lifecycle management is important. That's not necessarily because they want to avoid fines, although having the kind of regulatory schema in place that you described would be really helpful. But there also is the reality that if you have a huge refrigerant case in Walmart and your refrigerant leaks and the temperature goes up, you can lose a lot of inventory, right? And so there is some level of focus on this, even amongst those who are just sort of profit-driven. The challenge for them, I think, is a couple-fold. One, margins in a lot of those businesses are pretty thin. And so although there are solutions to enable a lot of those actors to monitor what's happening with refrigerants in their systems, and some of them are pretty lightweight, right? We've got one company in our food program, Glacier, that does this reasonably well. There are others. It still requires purchase, installation, maintenance, and someone to be paying attention to those signals. Also, we hear a lot from sort of all of those different actors that getting technicians who are trained to undertake the kinds of activities you're talking about is a real impediment. And so, I think there's workforce development that's necessary. There's still some level of education. There's obviously training. And I agree, the regulatory framework could be better in many places. Anastasia's not going to say something.
I think there's some other barriers, and I'm still very much learning what they are in the real world. But from what we've also heard with technicians training, that initial certification that you mentioned, it's a once and done certification, so people are not required to then get recertified over time. And then, there's a lot of training that's needed. And then incentive for those technicians to spend the extra time and literally drive further to drop off the refrigerant. Enforcement is very low, I've heard. I don't have a good data source to back this up, but I've heard that even in the US, which does have proper laws on this, that compliance is at something like 10%. And perhaps there's someone in the room who can give me that data source. But in other countries, it's even lower. And so what's in it for the technicians to actually do, they're meant to, they probably know that it's the law, but it takes longer for them, it's a bit harder, it's a bit more of a hassle, and they don't necessarily get paid or rewarded for doing this. So that's why we think, more incentives are sort of needed, more training, more certification, more standards, as well on the technician side. On the buyer side, or on the sort of asset owners, I will just say, there's not a lot of strong incentives for them either right now, and it's something we want to work on. If you look at the SBTI and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, basically all of those corporate footprinting reporting standards make this optional to report on. And so that's a huge gap. That's why, for example, Yale didn't report on this properly. So it was an optional thing to keep track of all these emissions and do the proper footprinting of that, which they've now corrected. But it added 10% to the footprint, and that was a real 10%. So, there's a whole raft of actions that we as a community need to work on. And it's quite a pragmatic kind of issue of accounting and purchasing specs and making sure people up and down the value chain know what actually is going on and recognize how important these gases actually are.
Great, thank you. Switching gears a little bit, Anastasia, how can the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council help business and government organizations focus on refrigerants to meet or exceed their sustainability goals?
Yeah, so the SPLC, or Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, it's a non-profit, and it's a big membership group of large purchasing entities trying to do more sustainable purchasing one way or the other. A lot of the guidance that group has put out and best practices, is there, the organizations can look at it, adopt it. I think there's a big additional push that could be done. And I think it's quite tricky when you're working with government procurement people in particular, because they have to be very careful not to listen to guidance just given by industry or by non-profits for that matter. And so you have to be quite careful with governance around how to actually develop good guidance so that they can take it on board. And when they put it into their procurement contracts, they don't then get protests and contests back on the other end. So it takes a while. It's a bit of a slow process to develop that kind of specifications and whatnot. Now, what we found before, and I'd love to hear the experience of this group as well, is that the more simple you can make it, the better. And if you literally send them the text to copy paste, that's the best. So, you know, people are busy. They are buying across massive numbers of categories. This is one of like thousands of product categories they're thinking about. They don't have the time necessarily to get into it. And so the more you can show them, one, it's worth their time, this is a big impact category, this is something that you can make a real difference on right away, that's helpful, and then also just give them the tools to do it. But I'm really curious to see what REEF comes out with, and there's all sorts of other purchasing entities as well who I think we should be engaging too. Yeah. Others with experience with purchases. Sounds like you have some there as well with the retail sector perhaps.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add for now, but I would agree with everything you said, and curious about the council maybe to interact with them a little, ask about it later.
Okay, and to the panel. What do you see as key challenges to business and governmental organizations as they try to apply decarbonization to HVAC? Is it awareness, assessment, policies and practice, or something else?
From my perspective, I think one of the things that really stands out about the building sector, HVAC, refrigerants, all being a subset of that, right, is how diffuse the customer base is compared to other areas that need decarbonization, right? Like, let's take steel for an example. Massive problem. That there are only so many steel companies out there. There are only so many steel plants out there, right? It's a finite number. There are so many buildings. There are so many buildings, and they're all owned by different people. I cannot find you a list of all the building owners out there, right? And it's not like a steel company where it's like, I'm a steel company, I produce steel, and therefore we need to think about how to decarbonize steel, right? We're talking about buildings where all of us spend most of our time in buildings, and very few people understand how these buildings actually work. Like, what is the HVAC equipment inside of them that keeps me warm, that keeps me cool, etc., right? So it just, from thinking about climate technologies generally, you know, one of the big, like, business model challenges for buildings, for HVAC, for refrigerants, is just how diffuse that customer base really is.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and implied in your answer is just the different building technologies, right? So we talk about HVAC in buildings as though that's a monolithic thing. It's certainly not in terms of the customers, but it's also just not in terms of the buildings, right? A single family detached home is pretty different from this building. It's really different from a tall multifamily building. And the solutions, HVAC solutions, for any of them are different from those for the other typologies. So it's complicated. I mean, I think, not to oversimplify, but you heard a little bit of my background. I'm a business guy by background. I mean, a lot of it comes down to economics, right? If you're thinking about turning over HVAC systems in all of those buildings over time, or many of them that need to be decarbonized, the business case has to make a lot of sense, and it has to make sense really soon. And it doesn't for a lot of those typologies for a variety of reasons. So that's the heart of it. There are a lot of other issues, but to me, that's really the driving force. And when we talk to those owner-operators of larger buildings, that's really what we hear, right? The business case has to pencil.
Yeah, I'll just say, compared to other decarbonisation efforts, however, this one is relatively cheap. So, you know, it depends what you're comparing it to. Yes, you might need to, you know, refurbish a system or change it, but compared to changing, you know, a whole, you know, heating system or electrifying a whole building, like this actually might be an easier fix than you think. It doesn't mean you have to go all the way to, that's why we think lifecycle refrigerant management is actually quite a good idea, because it doesn't mean necessarily jumping to the absolute perfect best system. There's a lot of things you can do along the way to make it much better. Use, buy the reclaimed refrigerant, for example. Stop the leaks. This is not necessarily really a whole-scale refresh of a building.
It's a fair point. It depends on what we're talking about, right? If we're talking about running an existing system better, depending on what the system is in the building, you're absolutely right. If you're talking about replacing an HVAC system, which I'll talk about a little bit later, there are still more expensive things, but that's obviously a different hill to climb. So that goes back to the diversity point that Stephanie made, right? In some cases, we're talking about managing the refrigerant better. That's not a small thing, but it's a lot smaller than some other projects. In other cases, we're talking about a bigger project.
Just to add the policy side to it, I'm not sure if everybody's aware, but let's say when the EPA uses, let's say the AIM Act, that okay, we're going to go under a certain global warming potential for air conditioning or refrigeration systems. When it comes to HVAC, there are mechanical, fire, and safety codes for each state that have to change to accommodate all of that. And we've had some experiences with some field studies where, we cannot put that heat unit in that state because their building code has not allowed that refrigerant. So I'm hoping REEF can do some work in that education and awareness.
I hope so too.
Yes. So to make the refrigerant transition easier. I know it's not easy, 50 different states with different climates, different perspectives. So that is a big hurdle, at least on my side. What I've seen is a big barrier to the low GWP refrigerant transition.
It's a bold panel. I'm just going to note that. Anastasia's calling out Yale, Saad is calling out REEF right on the panel. I mean, it's pretty good. Trying to keep you awake.
Okay, great. Thank you.